July 14th, 1943. 2:17 in the afternoon. The sun hammers down on a makeshift processing compound at the edge of a converted fairground in Concordia, Kansas. The temperature stands at 94 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat so foreign to most of the men shuffling through the registration lines that they have no adequate word for it. 347 German prisoners of war, captured in the collapsing cauldron of Tunisia just weeks before, stand in orderly formation. Their Afrika Korps uniforms, once the proud khaki of Rommel's invincible desert army, are faded to the color of old bone. Their boots are cracked. Their faces carry the particular hollowness of men who have surrendered not just their weapons but their certainty, their absolute, ideologically reinforced certainty about the nature of the world they inhabit. Feldwebel Kurt Langers, 31 years old, a school teacher from Freiburg in Breisgau before the war remade him into a signal sergeant, stands near the middle of the formation. He has survived El Alamein. He has survived the grinding retreat across Libya. He has survived the final collapse at Cap Bon, where the sea offered no escape and the desert offered no cover, and the only remaining choice was the one no soldier is trained to want. He is not a man who breaks easily. He has told himself in the long weeks of transit across the Atlantic in an American transport ship that moved with such casual mechanical confidence it seemed to mock every fuel shortage he had ever witnessed, that he will not be broken here either. Whatever they show him, whatever trick they attempt, he will observe it with the cold eyes of a man who knows how propaganda works. He has been told what America is. He knows what to expect. He does not yet know that within the next 40 minutes, a young private first class from Indiana named Tommy Schreiber will approach the prisoner formation carrying a large metal container packed in ice. He does not yet know what that container holds. He does not yet know that the sight of its contents, simple, mundane, utterly ordinary to every American within 100 yards, will crack something open inside him that no artillery barrage had ever reached. He does not yet know that he is about to encounter something his entire ideological education had no framework to explain. To understand why a container of ice cream could fracture the worldview of a battle-hardened Wehrmacht sergeant, it is necessary to understand what that worldview was built upon and how carefully, over how many years, it had been constructed to be impenetrable. By the summer of 1943, the Third Reich's propaganda apparatus, arguably the most sophisticated psychological warfare machine the modern world had yet produced, had been shaping the mental landscape of German soldiers for nearly a decade. The work of Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Public Enlightenment had never been merely about delivering messages. It had been about constructing an alternative reality so internally consistent, so reinforced at every level of daily life that competing information had nowhere to take root. By the time most German soldiers reached the front, their image of America had been carefully and deliberately assembled from specific, chosen materials. America, in this constructed vision, was decadent. It was a mongrel nation. That specific word, with all its contemptuous biological implication, appeared regularly in official publications and military briefings alike. It was a country of jazz music and Hollywood illusions, of racial impurity and moral softness, of capitalist exploitation masquerading as freedom. Its people, German soldiers were taught, were divided against themselves, by class, by race, by the fundamental incoherence of a democratic system that mistook noise for strength. The Wehrmacht soldier, by contrast, was the product of a unified people, a disciplined culture, a civilization with the clarity of historical purpose. American soldiers, when they finally appeared in North Africa in 1942, had seemed to confirm this analysis. The disaster at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where green American troops broke before a German armored assault, leaving behind equipment, wounded and considerable dignity, had been celebrated in German newspapers with barely concealed glee. What the newspapers had not covered, because the newspapers were not permitted to cover things that complicated the picture, was what happened at Kasserine after the initial rout. American commanders, most critically General George S. Patton, who assumed command of Todt Corps on March 6, 1943, and began the most aggressive 48-hour transformation of a military culture that his subordinates had ever witnessed, reorganized, retrained, and returned with a ferocity that accelerated the Axis collapse in North Africa beyond. anything German command had anticipated. By May 13, 1943, 250,000 Axis troops, German and Italian, had surrendered in Tunisia. It was a defeat of Stalingrad proportions, and it deposited, in a matter of weeks, an enormous number of German soldiers directly into the custody of a country they had been taught to despise. Those soldiers were now in Kansas, in Texas, in Georgia, in Mississippi, in Arizona, in states they had never heard of, in a country that was about to spend the next 2 years contradicting everything they believed. They had been told that America was weak. They expected to find hunger. This requires a moment of stillness to absorb properly, because it is the psychological key to everything that followed. German soldiers in 1943 understood food the way soldiers in any war understand it, as a weapon, a reward, a measure of power, and a constant anxiety. By 1943, German civilian food rations had been tightening for years. The average German civilian received approximately 2,000 calories per day in official rations, a figure that sounded adequate in theory and felt increasingly marginal in practice, particularly as the war consumed more and more of Europe's agricultural production and the Allied naval blockade, slowly tightened around the continent's supply lines. On the front, German soldiers ate better than civilians, but the logistics of feeding a Wehrmacht spread across 3 continents under relentless Allied air interdiction was an operation that creaked and sometimes broke. In Tunisia, in the final weeks before the surrender, some units had been reduced to captured Allied rations. American K rations, intercepted and consumed by German soldiers who had no other option, were generally regarded with something between bewilderment and reluctant appreciation. But they were emergency rations. Prison food would be different. Prison food was always worse. This was not an unreasonable expectation given historical precedent. In most of the conflicts that living memory could recall, prisoners of war existed at the mercy of economies already strained by warfare, fed from whatever surplus remained after the feeding of fighting men, civilians, and the apparatus of the state. German soldiers who had guarded Soviet prisoners in the early years of the Eastern Front had seen what happened when an occupying power simply chose not to prioritize enemy lives. The Geneva Convention existed, technically, but conventions are words, and words are fragile things when industrial civilization is at war with itself. What they found, instead, was a country that had not rationed bread. The American war economy of 1943 was a phenomenon that had no equivalent in human history. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States would produce 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and enough food to feed not only its own military and civilian population, but significant portions of its allies as well. Agricultural production had not declined with the war. It had increased, mechanized, optimized, expanded onto land that had lain fallow during the Depression years. American farms were producing surpluses that the government was actively managing, distributing, and in some cases storing, because the economy of plenty had outrun even wartime demand. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war receive rations equivalent to those of the capturing army's base troops, soldiers in training. Not combat soldiers at reduced ration, but base troops in permanent facilities. American base troop rations in 1943 provided approximately 3,400 to 4,000 calories per day, depending on the facility and the season. They included meat, they included fresh vegetables, they included coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz barley and chicory substitute that had been standard in Germany since 1939. They included white bread made from refined flour at a time when most of occupied Europe had not seen white bread in years. And on certain days in certain camps, particularly during the summer months when the problem of spoilage made distribution logistics creative, they included ice cream. The records of the Concordia, Kansas prisoner of war facility, maintained in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and examined in detail by historian Arnold Kramer in his foundational 1979 study, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, document the July 1943 distribution with the bureaucratic precision that military quartermaster operations require. The entry is not dramatic. It lists quantities, temperatures, times, distribution points. It does not record the reactions of 347 men encountering something their captors considered an ordinary summer afternoon treat. For that, historians have had to turn to other sources. The letters and diaries of German prisoners of war, many preserved in German federal archives, others collected by researchers in the decades after the war, return again and again to the same categories of experience, and the shock is always proportional not to the magnitude of what they encountered but to the distance between expectation and reality. Historian Judith Gansberg, whose 1977 work Stalag USA drew on extensive prisoner correspondence and post-war interviews, quotes one unnamed German NCO's letter to his family, smuggled out through a sympathetic neutral intermediary in late 1943, which reads, "They gave us ice cream. I have sat for an hour trying to determine what this means, and I cannot. Either they are trying to confuse us deliberately, or this country is something we were never told the truth about." Feldwebel Werner Heidemann, captured at Tunis and processed through Camp Forest, Tennessee, would describe in a 1967 memoir written for his grandchildren the precise moment of his first American meal. "I waited," he wrote, "for the trick to be revealed. When I was given meat, I thought perhaps the next meal would be the real ration. When the next meal also contained meat, I began to feel something I did not have a name for yet. It was the feeling of a mathematical certainty being disproven. When they brought ice cream, in summer, yes, but still, in a prisoner of war camp, I looked at the American guard beside me, and I asked, through the interpreter, whether this was a special occasion. He looked at me as if I had asked whether air was a special occasion. He said, 'It's Thursday.' It was Thursday." The accumulation of such moments across hundreds of camps, there were eventually over 500 prisoner of war facilities in 45 states, housing at peak capacity approximately 425,000 German prisoners, created what scholars have come to recognize as one of the most significant and least discussed psychological phenomena of the Second World War. In the camps, the propaganda architecture that had taken years to construct collapsed in many cases within weeks. Not because of argument, not because of lectures or counter-propaganda efforts, though the American government would eventually implement a re-education program called the Intellectual Diversion Program in 1944. But because of the inescapable, daily, mundane evidence of what America actually was. Documents declassified in the 1970s and 1980s reveal that American military intelligence analysts, monitoring prisoner mail and conducting systematic interviews, tracked this psychological shift with considerable interest. A September 1943 report from the Provost Marshal General's office notes that prisoner attitudes in the first 6 months of captivity showed a statistically significant softening toward American institutions, and attributes this specifically to the effect of material conditions demonstrably superior to prisoner expectations. The report is careful and measured, as military intelligence reports tend to be. But reading between its cautious lines, one encounters the shape of something remarkable: an empire's propaganda dissolving under the weight of ice cream and white bread, and the casual, unremarkable generosity of a country too busy winning the war to understand how extraordinary it appeared to the men it was feeding. The transformation was not universal, it was not immediate, and it would be a distortion of historical truth to suggest that every German prisoner of war emerged from American captivity as a convert to democratic values. The POW population was, by any measure, politically complex. American military administrators, not fully prepared for the scale of capture in North Africa, and caught again by the millions of German surrenders in Europe in 1945, frequently found themselves managing camps where committed National Socialists, some of them fanatical SS veterans, coexisted, alongside ordinary Wehrmacht conscripts who had always held their ideology more lightly. In camps where Nazi hardliners held social power, they enforced conformity through intimidation and, in documented cases, violence. At Camp Hearn in Texas, A German prisoner suspected of being too sympathetic to American captors was found beaten in his barracks. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a complex escape tunnel was constructed by committed officers who still believed the war might be won. The mythology of German invincibility, maintained against all material evidence, was a more durable thing than any single gesture of abundance could erase. Yet the evidence accumulates. Letter after letter, memoir after memoir, post-war interview after post-war interview. The ice cream appears, the white bread appears, the meat appears, the coffee appears, and something shifts. Hans Werner Richter, who would later become one of the most significant figures in post-war German literature, as the founder of Group of 47, the intellectual circle that would shape West German cultural life for decades, spent time in American captivity after his capture in Italy in 1944. His experiences in the American camp system, his encounters with the country's material reality and its democratic culture, are widely credited by literary scholars as foundational to his post-war political commitments. He arrived, like most of his contemporaries, carrying the weight of everything he had been told. He departed with something more complicated and more useful, a first-hand education in the difference between ideology and actuality. Years later, he would describe American captivity not as humiliation, but as revelation, an enforced encounter with a world that operated according to principles his upbringing had dismissed as fiction. The Americans, he wrote in one of his late essays, defeated us twice. Once on the battlefield, once in the mess hall. The ice cream itself, as an object, as a symbol, as a recurring presence in the documentary evidence of German prisoners' psychological transformation, carries a weight disproportionate to its simplicity. Ice cream in America in 1943 was democratic in the most literal sense. It crossed class lines with cheerful indifference. A child in Indiana ate the same vanilla soft serve as the president's grandchildren. It required refrigeration, technology, the invisible infrastructure of a country that had electrified its rural areas through the New Deal programs of the 1930s, while most of occupied Europe lit its evenings with kerosene. It required surplus dairy, the abundance of a continental agricultural system operating at peacetime capacity even as the world burned. It required the particular American conviction that ordinary pleasures are not luxuries, that comfort is not decadence, that the man driving a truck or teaching school or filling artillery shells on a factory line deserves, on Thursday afternoon, something cold and sweet. This was not what German soldiers had been told America was. This was, in some ways, the most revolutionary thing they had ever encountered. Not democracy as a concept, not freedom as an abstraction, but democracy as a flavor. The simple, staggering, impossible democracy of dessert. It appeared in the documents not because American authorities thought it significant, but because the German prisoners did. They wrote about it in letters they knew would be read by censors. They included it in diaries kept in languages they hoped their guards could not read. They mentioned it in post-war memoirs written 20 and 30 years later, when the men who had experienced it were middle-aged, raising children in a rebuilt West Germany, and still found, when they reached for examples of the moment the world they had been promised turned out to be false, that they returned to the same image. A metal container, packed in ice. On a Thursday afternoon in Kansas, Feldwebel Kurt Langers, the schoolteacher from Freiburg, the signal sergeant who had survived El Alamein and Cap Bonn and the long transit across the Atlantic, returned to Germany in June of 1946. American authorities had held most German prisoners well past the war's end, partly from logistical necessity and partly, in the case of those who had gone through re-education programming, from a belief that sending changed men back into a shattered country might matter. He returned to Freiburg to find that his school had been bombed flat. His mother had survived. His brother had not returned from the Eastern Front. The city he had grown up in wore its destruction openly, the way a wounded man eventually stops covering his wound because concealment has become too exhausting. He returned to teaching. In the British occupation zone, and then in the new West German state, he spent the next 31 years standing in front of classrooms, teaching German language and literature to children who had been born into the world the war had made. He never wrote a memoir. He left no archive. What is known about his post-war life comes from a single interview he gave in 1978 to a researcher from the University of Freiburg, collecting oral histories of the prisoner of war experience, a project funded by the German Federal Foundation for the Study of the National Socialist Era. In that interview, he was asked whether American captivity had changed his political views. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "They gave us ice cream. Not once. Regularly, because it was summer and they had too much of it and they believed that prisoners were men." I spent many years thinking about that. I am still thinking about it. He was asked what conclusion he had reached. That the greatest damage any state can do to its own people, he said, is to teach them that the enemy is not human. Because when you discover that the enemy is human, you must also discover what that means about everything else you were taught. Feldwebel Kurt Langers, schoolteacher, died in Freiburg im Breisgau in 1989, the same year the wall came down, the same year the world his captivity had given him a glimpse of finally, imperfectly, incompletely arrived on his continent's doorstep. He did not live to see the spring. But the students he had spent 31 years teaching, the children who had sat in his classroom and received, from a man who had learned the lesson in the most unexpected possible classroom, some transmission of what he had understood in Kansas in July of 1943, they were there. They were in the crowds. They were watching the wall fall. What is remembered of the Second World War tends toward the dramatic, the battles, the leaders, the turning points that textbooks have identified with the confidence of retrospect. What is less often remembered is this: the quiet, cumulative, daily work of material truth dissolving ideological certainty. The ways in which a nation reveals itself not in its monuments or its speeches or its declarations, but in what it considers ordinary, what it considers unremarkable, what it hands to a prisoner on a Thursday afternoon and cannot quite understand why he is staring at it with such complete and absolute astonishment. It was just ice cream. It was only ever just ice cream. And yet,